Welcome to the Zencast. My name is Dale Pickles. I am the host of the Zencast and the managing director of B Squared. The Zencast is here as a way to improve knowledge around SEND. There is lots of stuff you can go and read, but we're all very busy and we do not have the time. The Zencast is also a great way to get the same consistent message to schools, external professionals, and parents. In this week's episode, we're discussing living with dyscalculia, and this week I have two guests, Peter Cherry and Cat Eadle. Peter is a volunteer for the Dyscalculia Network, and he is the chair of the Adults with Dyscalculia Advisory Board. And Cat is one of the co-founders of the Dyscalculia Network and co-author of the innovative series of books Succeed with Dyscalculia. The Zencast is created and produced by us here at B Squared. And as well as this podcast, we also have our Zencast sessions, our online CPD. If you haven't accessed a Zencast session before, then these are video CPD sessions, generally a PowerPoint presentation being delivered, and often with the same great guests as the podcast. We run 9 live sessions and 2 free send briefings every year. The sessions are £10 per school, but you can watch live on the day or watch later on. We have over 130 sessions you can now purchase and use for CPD across the whole school. Now, let's get on with the podcast. In this week's show, we're discussing living with dyscalculia. This week, I have two guests, Peter Cherry and Cat Eadle. Peter has dyscalculia and is a volunteer for the Dyscalculia Network, where he chairs the Adults with Dyscalculia Advisory Board. Peter has been interviewed by a variety of organisations about his experiences, and you'll find some of those links in the show notes. Cat is the founder of the Dyscalculia Network and co-author of the innovative series of books Succeed with Dyscalculia. Cat is heavily focused running and developing the Dyscalculia Network with Rob Jennings. They're also involved in organising the Dyscalculia show at the NEC in Birmingham. And see how many times I said the word dyscalculia already. Welcome to the show, Peter, and welcome to the show, Cat.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
You are welcome. So before we move on to living with dyscalculia, what is dyscalculia?
So dyscalculia is a specific and persistent difficulty with understanding number, which can lead to a range of difficulties with maths. It occurs across all age ranges, levels of education and ability, and it can occur singly, but it can also co-occur with other conditions such as dyslexia or ADHD or ASD. We're actually expecting a new definition in England of dyscalculia in the next few weeks. And the early signs of that is it's going to be mapped very closely to the new dyslexia definition. There's going to be emphasis on that specific and persistent difficulty still. But there's also going to be a real emphasis on the fact that dyscalculia is a lifelong condition and its impact can be different at different stages of somebody's life. And I think it's really important. One of the things that's also going to be made clear is the difference between dyscalculia and other maths difficulties. Because dyscalculia is something where there's a specific difficulty with numerical magnitude processing. That's a very specific area of magnitude comparing and ordering and understanding number. But also people can have a maths learning difficulty where the numeric processing isn't impacted, but the impairment is still significant. So we're going to be making more of a clear definition of what dyscalculia is and what maths difficulties are. Because somebody can have maths difficulties and they can still cause them considerable impact on their life, but it might not be dyscalculia. So there's going to be some clearer guidance around that.
Interesting. So what does that look like for you, Peter?
Okay, well, dyscalculia affects me in different ways. I guess in my sort of daily life, I can say that reading numbers is a big issue. So, for example, in my job, occasionally I have to deal with numbers, and I'll find if somebody writes something without commas and without spaces, my brain will just really struggle to comprehend what that number is. And, there was one instance at work actually where I just got given this number, which was just a mix of, just looked like a mess of noughts, to be honest. But having those kind of spaces or those commas really help. And in fact, even sometimes just writing it out in words actually is sometimes better for me. So that way, mental maths, which is a horrible phrase, but nonetheless, that's very, very difficult for me. I can't really kind of hold numbers in my head and conceptualize them. Budgeting is another really big issue. And many of the adults that write to us with dyscalculia talk about having been in debt, struggling with their personal finances. And that's quite difficult because a lot of dyscalculics struggle to associate value and number. So that's another thing. So they might know the number, but they can't quite get the concept of value there. Estimating numbers, understanding values, as I mentioned, it really impacts driving as well. So a number of people with dyscalculia have talked about struggling with driving. So that can be left and right is an issue, but also things like reading speedometers and things like that. And I do just want to pick up on one thing as well that Kat was mentioning, which is there's a real tendency, and I fall into this myself sometimes, with dyscalculia, which, by the way, is pronounced to rhyme like Julia. So that's another big stumbling block is how to pronounce it. So we always say pronounced to rhyme like Julia. But there is a struggle, I think, with describing it as dyslexia in numbers. Yeah, as I said, I admit sometimes I use that shorthand as well, but it is ultimately unhelpful because someone with dyslexia might also have issues with number, as Kat was mentioning, maths anxiety, things like this. But that's very different from, for example, the mathematical concepts, which is what someone with dyscalculia will struggle with. So they might have problems with understanding value, as we've said, and, with maths problems. So a common thing when you do your sort of GCSE exams or whatever, you'll have like a word maths problem. Now, I, for example, will have no problem understanding the words, but what I will have problems with will be the concepts underneath. So that's really where kind of dyslexia and dyscalculia are different, or one area anyway.
And one thing it's probably really, really important to mention is dyscalculia. When he said, that's how I say it, isn't it? It's dyscalculia, like Julia. Dyscalculia. What's the other way of saying it then? Just because I literally can't say it any other way now in my head.
Well, that's good. That means it's
best not to say it.
Otherwise,
best not to say it another way. Dyscalculia.
Okay, dyscalculia. I'm very glad I was saying it the right way then. So it's nothing to do with intellect.
No.
Because, Peter, you have a PhD. So it's not like, if you can't do this, it's not an intelligence thing. It is purely, I cannot do this one area.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, it's like, for example, there have been so many impressive people that also have dyslexia, for example, and there have been some really positive campaigns, like Positive Dyslexia, that have come out that have shown us, the amount of people who are extremely capable, extremely talented, I mean, not to generalize, but actually often in the maths and science area that have dyslexia. I mean, the same can be said of people with dyscalculia. Unfortunately, we simply don't have the awareness there, but we are finding anecdotally. So as I said, I have a PhD in literature. I teach literature. We've had other people that have been coming that have been really talented in the arts. We've got a number of people that are coming through with acting skills, acting, music, all of this kind of area, but they really, really struggle with maths and believe they have dyscalculia. So I think that's again, so it's the idea that neurodiversity works like that, right? Which is that you can be very, very strong and gifted in some areas, but then other areas, are a struggle for you where they aren't for the majority of the population.
So when can you start to really identify dyscalculia? Because you're kind of saying there could be other math difficulties, and there's got to be a point where you've got to get to a certain stage and maybe go beyond that to then track back and go, when's that sort of, how early is that?
Well, I think that realistically, diagnosis of dyscalculia, most dyscalculia specialist level 7 assessors would prefer a child to be heading towards 8 at least to make a decision of whether they have dyslexia or dyscalculia, because they both often maybe co-occur. And the same as dyslexia, they'd wait until the child was about 8 years old, sometimes 7 if there's very specific difficulty very early on. But again, that diagnosis, the earlier the child gets that diagnosis, often the better, because we know that early intervention and early support can make a huge difference. But it isn't common for children to be identified with dyscalculia.
In fact, am I right in saying as well, there's research from Loughborough University, King Mosanyi, Loughborough University, that says still that with diagnosis, a child is 100 times more likely to be diagnosed with dyslexia than they are with dyscalculia, which is quite a stunning statistic, really. Yeah.
It's really interesting because I am almost the opposite of you, Peter. I'm like Goodwill Hunting with numbers. I can just look at the numbers, I can guesstimate, and I'll be really close. When I met you at the dyslexia show, we had this conversation. I found it really interesting that something I literally just take for granted, and I can't explain how I do it, you really struggle with. And I just sit there going, but you can just... that's when you sit there in your head, but I can. You can, and you fall into that trap of just going, well, if you just, it's literally is nothing you can really. It's not a case of with all this support, you'll fix it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's like, I don't know if you've had a similar situation with literacy, but sometimes it really strikes me. I'm so surprised that like people can do that. Like it's with mental maths. I remember being at school. I mean, lots of people hate mental maths. You don't have to have dyscalculia to kind of hate the idea that you're being in a classroom and someone's shouting at you what's like, I don't know, 7 times 8 or whatever. So, but I mean, I really struggled. I was like, can people actually do this in their heads? Because I just can't, there's aspects there of maths anxiety, my mind would go blank, but I also really do struggle to understand that connection between value and number. And in fact, in my daily life, so, with things like PIN numbers, codes to get into, rooms, things like that, offices. For me, I mean, I have to write them down. So always on my phone, I will have like, a notes thing where I've got them written down. But for me, I actually have to associate them with something. So I can remember them if they're like a friend's birthday or if they're a historical date. That's how I remember it. But if you just give me a mess of numbers, I'm just not going to remember it. And, that's a really common issue with people with dyscalculia.
Yes, if those listening to the podcast before will know how much I rant about how much I hate various parts of English.
Yeah, I mean, sure, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, it's those things I remember just sitting there going, I don't get what I'm supposed to be doing. This makes absolutely no sense. What's he thinking about? Well, it says quite clearly he means this. Well, there's an underlying tone. Is there? That was me. Almost polar opposite probably of you with that one, yes. Go on, Kat.
I was just going to say, I think there's also a danger that in society generally there's a little bit of, oh, I hated maths too. And that whole, oh, I hated maths and I was never any good at maths too. Oh, yeah, dyscalculia. Well, I was never any good at maths at school. There's quite a big difference between somebody who just didn't like maths. Maybe they weren't taught in a way that suited them particularly well. Maybe they got a little bit lost along the way. It happens to a lot of children and young people. There's a difference between that and having dyscalculia. And I think it's really important that we make it very clear that dyscalculia is a lifelong condition. Now, we're not saying that intervention doesn't make a difference, because, of course, it makes a huge difference. And children who get early support and intervention on building number sense, building this concept of value against number, and we can really work on that from early age, we can see children make huge progress and have a much better understanding of maths than they might have. But it's still going to be a lifelong condition, and there's still going to be things that as an adult, like budgeting or dealing with time, that they're going to find difficult, even if they've even got all of the maths skills in there.
When you think about maths in school and maths in real life, they are very different.
Yeah.
So there are probably lots of people struggling with budgeting who might be going, oh, I can't budget because almost like I don't see the maths problem. I don't see how I'm supposed to do the maths. Exactly. But it is still different. It is still very different.
Exactly. And that's, to be honest, that is like a sort of private campaign of mine, which is that I think, the maths that we learn in school, I don't know, I'm getting older now, so I don't know, it might be different. I don't think it is, though. Cat can reliably inform me of this. But the maths we learn in school is so divorced from the maths in everyday life. And I think that actually came across in, to be honest, some of the plans for the maths to 18. So the current government, are they actually the current government? We don't have a government at the moment. Yes, we do, but they're no MPs. I don't know. Perda. I don't know exactly. Anyway, but the UK government's plan to extend maths to 18, this was one of the big issues that came out of that, because at the moment you can train to be a maths teacher in the UK and you can never hear that. It's quite possible you will never hear the word dyscalculia. There's no compulsory training in it whatsoever. And that's a huge problem when we're talking around about 4 million people in the UK that have dyscalculia. So there will be dyscalculic kids in your classroom. But at the same time, that maths to 18, I mean, what is the point in extending it for a few more years when it's already not really working? And we're having all of these issues with, as we say, budgeting issues, etc. Like, why then do we not, instead of extending it to 18, focus on making sure that this is an inclusive curriculum which can support those with dyscalculia, support those with maths anxiety, and help them see the relevance of maths to their everyday life and give them the skills they need to get on in life.
No, I love maths. I did maths. I did further maths. Biggest mistake I probably ever made was doing the further maths part. Absolute pile of rubbish. But that's because I need to understand it. I need to almost like visually see it and work it out in my head and manipulate it. And when you get into pure maths, that just doesn't exist. You're talking things which doesn't actually exist. I just didn't see the point. But when I heard, and I like maths, when it was saying, let's go maths up to 18, I'm going, yeah, you're doing it wrong. Because that is like, everyone hates maths by the time they're 16. Let's punish them more for another 2 years. Now, the maths bit needs to change in primary so that people actually understand and get and enjoy maths. But that is a big project because that comes down to how maths is taught.
Yes.
And not doing these stupid things where you change and parents can't help their child's maths because they're doing it the wrong way and it's not following that school's calculation policy for that year group type stuff. I think that kind of needs to change.
I think, the primary maths curriculum on the whole is the content of that is very good and the methods taught are generally good and the children usually get a lot of support. I think for me, the difficulty comes with the lack of funding and the lack of support for maths in general in schools. It's very unusual for a school to have the ability to put forward a child like Peter, for example, who is excelling in one area but struggling in maths. Often they will not get any support at all because they'll just carry on through the system. And it's not the teacher's fault. The teachers will have identified there's a problem, but there's no funding, for example, to get an EP, educational psychologist report or a private assessor in unless the parents do that privately. And we certainly see that with the inquiries with the Dyscalculia Network. Nearly all of the parents say, the schools say you'll have to get that done privately if you want to get it done. But then when you go back to the school with the report, with recommendations, the school, we don't have the funding to be able to put those recommendations in place. So there's a problem there. But I think coming back to the GCSE curriculum, I teach a wide variety of children in a wide variety of ages. So as well as my work with the Dyscalculia Network, I run my own tutoring business. That's how I became involved in dyscalculia. Through that, I work with a lot of children with dyscalculia or with maths learning difficulties because of co-occurrence with other things. And the difficulty is GCSE is supposedly a one-size-fits-all curriculum, but it's not. So children who are not going to, I have several pupils who are going to be moving up to secondary school this September, and they will be put in classes, they will be put in a support group. Yes, they will get probably a slightly smaller group. People will be aware that they struggle with maths, but they still have to sit a GCSE curriculum. And that curriculum is not fit for those learners. Those learners need a curriculum that's on life skills, on learning about money, learning about time, and the other things that are in the GCSE curriculum are not really going to be relevant to their life. And if we could somehow manage to sort the GCSE curriculum out to have a curriculum for those who can't access the GCSE, and for that to be an acceptable different route to qualifications, much like we have in other schools, because functional skills, usually the pupils aren't allowed to go into functional skills till after they're 16. And then they haven't practiced the basic skills.
I think it's with the functional skills. I think I read somewhere that basically functional skills do not count towards the Progress 8. So it is better for the school to take the GCSEs and fail the GCSEs than it is for that child to actually get a qualification and do a curriculum and get a qualification that will actually support them in life, which is completely wrong.
And that I think that's my concern, because we know that maths anxiety goes along with dyscalculia. Now, maths anxiety isn't the same thing. Somebody can feel anxious about maths who's very good at maths. Top mathematicians can feel anxious about, finding an answer to this problem they've been working on for years. However, we do see a lot of co-occurrence with maths anxiety and dyscalculia. And once we've got a learner disengaging with maths because it's constantly too hard and you can't access it, then of course they're not going to want to, we call it the maths anxiety cycle of failure. They feel anxious, they can't access the work, so they don't work hard on the work because it seems out of their understanding. And then that then perpetuates the maths anxiety, and we go round in circles of them being almost doomed to fail. And with the dyscalculia in general being something that causes anxiety because you feel that anxiety around numbers, it's just so sad to see children not being given work that they can actually access and potentially do. Because if I think of something that I find really hard or that makes me anxious, mine is public speaking. I find it really hard. I don't have to do that every day. I can do it, I can set it out, I can make my time. But maths is every day in school. And children go in every day being set up to fail and knowing that they can't access the work that's in front of them. And I'm sure Peter can tell you how that feels.
Yeah, and I mean, I would actually extend that as well to say, maths is every day in school, but maths is every day in life. And I mean, that's one thing I have to say with going back to this maths to 18 thing. That's one aspect, which is that the core sort of problem, I actually agree with this idea that there needs to be more attention towards maths. I mean, maths is absolutely everywhere. It is as vital as English. But why are we not looking at the kind of the deeper problem within this? Why are we not looking at those that struggle? Why is there so much more there? I'm not saying it's perfect, but why is there so much more there for people that struggle with literacy than there is with maths? And how is that going to affect people further on? So something I would say, for example, is that, so I was diagnosed when I was a kid. I was diagnosed when I was about 10. And I think that was very early in those days. So I'm in my late 30s now. And I think at that stage, dyscalculia was, was there was even less awareness of it than there is now. And that was because there was a strong disparity, that I was on the sort of gifted side when it came to literacy and, English, writing, reading, 2 or 3 books, all of that stuff. But then the maths was, I was performing at a level which was not right for my age group. I was performing, very low. I was like struggling with some of the, what we'd say kind of foundational stepping stones, things like that. And it wasn't getting any better. And that's also something else that happens a lot with me is I forget numbers. I forget mathematical facts very, very easily. I forget sequences of numbers. It just doesn't stick in my head. And I would say, so at school, I did get some support. I used to take maths classes in the special educational needs centre. And I think there was just this idea that the same things had to be repeated constantly to me. But I found it became actually much bigger sort of problem when I was an adult. So when I was a teenager, I mean, you just want to be the same as everyone else. And I used to find it really, really embarrassing, personally, that I had to go to the special educational needs centre for maths. And I used to lie and say, tell people like, oh, I'm so good at maths, I have to go to this special centre because I was in the top set for English. And so it was quite embarrassing. And when you're thinking about socially as well, what your social group is, I found it really embarrassing. But when I became an adult, for me, the big problem was a few years ago, I struggled to find work. So I just say, so after studying at university, I taught English for a long time abroad. And then I went to do a PhD and had a job at university, and just the conditions of the pandemic, etc., ended up leaving the job. And I was aware then that I needed to retrain in something because the situation in higher education is not great at the moment. So I was thinking, well, I need to sort of develop some other skill. And I was actually planning to go into English teaching in schools. I was thinking of being a secondary A-level English teacher. I had interviews for PGCEs. They went really well. I got accepted on the courses until then, when it came to the final section, they just suddenly said, you don't have a maths GCSE. And I was like, well, I'm not going to be teaching maths. And then they said, well, I'm afraid you can't start the course, or you have to do a maths GCSE alongside all of your training, which is an awful thing for me to do because I'd already be, adding to the stress of doing a PGCE. It would just be impossible. So I decided then that I was going to take I was just going to get a job somewhere. I was hoping that I would get a job in just even like a supermarket, something like this, and do a maths GCSE whilst I was doing it. I quickly found out when I went to adult education centres that teachers didn't know what dyscalculia was. The first one I went to, it had huge numbers of people in the class. There was about 4 computers to, I think, about 40 students or so. The situation, it was terrible. The teacher didn't know when I said I had dyscalculia, because I remember her saying, she said, you don't look like the normal kind of student we get here, which in itself is probably something you shouldn't say, but never mind. And then she said, so why didn't you get your maths GCSE? And I said, well, I have dyscalculia. And it was like I was saying I was a unicorn or something. She was like, oh, I've heard about these, but I've never seen one in the wild, kind of thing. And I just thought, this is awful. This is really bad. Like, why is there not more awareness of this? I managed to switch to another maths course, and the teachers were a lot more sensitive, I can say. But nonetheless, it was a huge class size. So I got very little support. I needed that support. And again, the teacher said to me, I'll level with you. I've never actually had any training in dyscalculia. I'm aware of it, but I've never had any training in it. And you're thinking, how many adults must be coming into your classroom with dyscalculia? How is that acceptable? I mean, that's not an attack on her at all. It's an attack on system.
Surely that is the place where people who cannot do maths are going, because they need that GCSE. So there's probably a high percentage that you weren't the only person with dyscalculia in that room.
Exactly. And what was so interesting, this is actually around the time I started to get involved with the Dyscalculia Network as well. And what was so interesting is I found that if I got to the class slightly early, which is rare for me because timing's a big issue for me, I'm always late for things, but I would talk to people, and it was interesting because the amount of people who said like, oh, I used to teach English abroad, or I had studied English, or I studied history, or art, or music, and and they were all like, really well dressed, interesting people, but they were like, just maths, never. And I was thinking in my head, I'm sure you have dyscalculia. And they were just saying, this is my 3rd time, whatever. And I think this is when I do get angry, because I just think it's so unfair to just insist. These people probably have so much to give to society, and yet they are being held back by this maths GCSE. How many times do they have to do it? How many times must you make them fail? And to come from my own experience there, I found that in that year, I got to the point when I was applying to Sainsbury's and I was getting rejected because you don't have a maths GCSE.
Yep.
And I mean that
you have to.
Yeah. Sorry.
When I was growing up, you had to have your C's in English and maths.
Mm-hmm.
And I love my maths. Maths is great. I hated English.
Mm-hmm.
So on my GCSE results day, I did not care about any other result apart from my English. Because if I just got a C, I never, ever had to worry about it again. And I scraped by with 2 C's. So I completely get exactly where you are. Because if I had to redo that, I already had the anxiety over English. I used to get in so many arguments with my parents and the teachers. But you're in set 1 and all this. And I'm not. It's just something in my head about the logicness and rules that wasn't in English. I just didn't get it in the way it was taught. So I completely get, from my point of view, in that very short time that I had that anxiety over it, but to fail that, and then for people to keep going back.
Yeah.
And even though you can do all these things, and yet you get to this one area, and no one's going, hang on a minute, there might be something. That is so wrong.
It's so wrong.
I think it's more.
Sorry, Kat, you go ahead.
No, not at all. I was just going to say, because of the Dyscalculia Network, obviously we get approached multiple times a day, especially on our social media, and so many adults have struggled with maths their whole life. We had an over 70-year-old from Scotland lady contact us and say, thank you for your posts on social media. I've thought I was stupid my whole life, and I've just realised that I probably have dyscalculia. And I said, is there anything we can do? And she said, no, just knowing that there was a reason for my difficulty, the fact that I've always just been so confused by time and money and understanding number, and I couldn't retain anything that I was told. It's made me feel like I'm not stupid anymore. And that is so wrong. And it really concerns me about our young people, especially people who maybe need a different path and aren't traditionally academic, which is probably, to be honest, where I fell in. I worked really hard to pass. I didn't find school easy at all for different reasons. But when I look at young people who've got something to offer, even to get into an apprenticeship scheme now, which to be an apprenticeship, to be a plasterer or electrician or a plumber, or these things that people would be really good at because they've got practical skills, they're engaging with people, they would learn the maths that is relevant to their business if they had to, because it would be repeated practice. They're going on to these apprenticeship courses. Rob does a lot of work with apprentices, and they're getting kicked off their course because they can't pass the maths GCSE still, or they can't pass the equivalent functional skills. And yet these people would be brilliant at the jobs that we're talking about them doing, and they would have a great deal to offer. And I'm sure they would learn the maths around plumbing or electrics if they were taught it in relevance to what they were doing. And that is so sad. That to me is really sad. And my dad really struggled at school, and he was an electrician apprentice. It wasn't maths he struggled with, it was more English. And if I think now, he probably wouldn't have been able to become an electrician now. And yet he's had his whole career, his whole life in run his own business, been very successful. And so many young people aren't getting opportunities to do things that they would be good at.
We had a gardener who used to work for us, and he did all our work, patio, bricklaying, most amazing. He was absolutely phenomenal. And after about knowing him for a year and doing various projects in the garden, including the most amazing patio, which literally looks brand new 12 years later type thing, I found out he couldn't read or write or anything. And I'm going, so how are you sending your invoices? My wife does all of that. But so not only he's learnt to completely mask everything, but also if you go into a screw fix, I'm ordering off my phone and walking in there and collecting my order and walking out. And you see these builders in there going, oh, this is what I need. And going through it and saying it verbally. And I'm literally going, I wonder if they can't, or their literacy or numeracy skills are quite low. So they're having to say it verbally. But they're still working. They're still doing their job. They're contributing. They're successful. They do the most amazing work. So setting a bar for English and maths, being able to access Shakespeare and doing differentiation or whatever it is, makes no sense.
I totally agree.
And it's not that we don't believe in there being a standard. And I think that's really important, because I don't want somebody listening to this say, oh, the Dyscalculia Network don't believe in GCSE or don't believe in there being standards for people. Of course, there has to be a standard, but wouldn't it be so nice if that standard was realistic to what the person was going to do in life, and that they were given the support in the right skills. And I know there's a big financial impact of that, of providing support for people with different needs. And people do have to make an effort as well. And that's, we're not saying that people don't have to try hard, and, progress comes from effort as well.
Afford to get a job. Then you got all these people who can't get a job. Well, you need to get a job. But you've kind of set the rules as a country really hard that if you don't have these GCSEs, you cannot get a job. But we don't want to give you any money to support you. One of these rules have to change.
Precisely.
And I think people...
Sorry. No, I mean, to be honest, I was just going to give more of an kind of emotional answer, which is no, I absolutely, I sometimes, I was talking about that maths class and the people I was talking to before I went into the maths class. And to be honest, sometimes I do, I can get really emotional actually thinking about it, because I just think it's so unfair. And then given the maths to 18 kind of policy idea, when that sort of came out, again, I just felt so emotional about it, because I just wished that politicians would actually go out and speak to these people and try and understand what they're going through, because there are so many people in the UK that are extremely bright, extremely talented, that are being held back by this maths GCSE. And there was a real temptation to use a word that rhymes with duck before the maths there. But Kat, you can give a more sophisticated answer now.
No, not at all. I totally agree with you. I think that it's a real shame that people aren't getting the support they need to get maths that's going to suit them for life. And that's the key, isn't it? We need skills that are relevant. And so many people there's so many more jobs out there as well in different things. I mean, when I was young, I can't imagine, a brand ambassador being a job, I didn't, there's things that people can do that can become, amazing businesses and skills. And they need to have a business head, but there's going to be maths involved in that. But like you say, there's ways around everything. But, Peter was very fortunate in a lot of ways because he had a very supportive parent. His mother identified that he needed help early. He got early support, even if it wasn't necessarily exactly the right support. He did get support and he got early diagnosis, and he's had a long time to learn to live with that. But many people don't get a diagnosis at all, or they're coming as an adult. And also they don't come maybe from a background where education is valued in the same way, or they've had support at home in the same way. And that is causing us, more difficulties. The amount of people, for example, in prison who struggle with neurodiversity and who probably have dyscalculia and haven't had support in education. There's lots of facets to this, isn't there?
So when we think of dyscalculia, are we talking like 1 in 100 people?
We're talking about 6%. So 6 in 100 people.
So 6 in 100 is more or less, you're in the 1 in 30 zone, aren't you? So that is more or less.
In a classroom, they say probably you're going to have around 2 out of 30 if you're really to be realistic. But then that's only the people who have dyscalculia specifically. You're probably going to have a quarter of your class, on my personal experience, at least a quarter of your class who struggle with maths for various different reasons because of that co-occurrence. And again, the new definition is going to talk about the fact that co-occurrence is the norm, not the exception. So the maths difficulties are going to come with other things. I mean, the BDA say that about 60% of people with dyslexia are going to find maths difficult due to the difficulties with sequencing, processing information, working memory, and so on. That's a large percent of people, again, in the classroom. There might be some co-occurrence too, that are going to be struggling with maths. So the good thing is that all the things that we do for dyscalculic learners work for any learner who's struggling with maths. So if we are using good methods for dyscalculic children, that's also going to help all those other children or young people.
So Peter, earlier you said kind of you're late to things. So is that a time blindness thing? Is it a case of reading the numbers and going, okay, when is that? What sort of reasons do you struggle with time? Is it that you literally just completely forget about time, or is it literally the reading and understanding when things are and how long things take?
Yeah, I think I don't have the best understanding of how long things are. So time, I think that's another really big thing. So for some reason, I have this internal dialogue all the time with 15 minutes, because I sort of think like, 15 minutes is quite a bit of time. It's not really. So there's things like that. And it's organisation. I'm not very good at organisation, which, I mean, I should also say I also have dyspraxia as well. So that's the kind of friend that dyscalculia came with. And so that could be attached to that. But that's also, again, something else that lots of people with dyscalculia talk about, which is kind of organisation and time management. So again, this kind of idea of you can see, 2:15, for example, but what actually is 2:15? So, if you are still at like 2:10 thinking, I've got time to, I don't know, do this. No, you haven't. But that's something that someone with dyscalculia will often struggle with. Also, analog clocks are something that dyscalculics often struggle with. So digital tends to be better for dyscalculics.
So go on.
So I was just going to say the difficulty of that, of course, is reading a digital clock doesn't tell you how many minutes till your meeting at 3:00, because you've still got to understand the concept of it's 3:35, and that means there's 25 minutes till 4:00. And that concept comes with understanding an analog clock. So the finding the difference between times and then being able to know how much that feels like is a real struggle.
So my daughter does not get analog clocks. She can only do digital. If you say 2:45, she just looks at you and just says, and she'll say to me, say it properly. I go, 2:45. She went, cool. Quarter to what? What do you mean quarter? What's a quarter? Quarter. And she just has this thing. And it is, but also I remember being on a plane with her. She's like, how long till we get there? And it's like 4 hours. Oh, okay. Half an hour later. How long left? Like about 3.5 hours. I went, it's like you can watch 2 or 3 films. And then she realizes by me saying that, she now gets the amount of time.
Absolutely.
But she does good at maths. But it's so interesting. I was trying to work out, but it might be a time blindness, which I keep seeing coming across, this idea of a time blindness.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because we were working with someone with dyscalculia, and she said that she used to time things according to how long Taylor Swift songs were. And also, like, I have to say as well, like, I guess I'm sort of aging myself here, but I always think as well, like 20 minutes, I always think that's how long a Simpsons episode is. So like, I'm always like, these kinds of things actually really help me understand how long I've got. So yeah, these are kind of big sort of dyscalculic problems.
Because the thing is, when you say a number, as you said, how long is 15 minutes? How long is if I got this, how long? You got enough time to watch a Simpsons episode. Oh, okay, I know what I can do in that time.
Yeah.
And it is interesting, is what time is it? It's 3 Simpsons past lunch.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Exactly.
But I can work that out. I can work that out myself. That's the thing, is that makes sense to me. Or how long have we got left? 2 Simpsons. And I've learned that. But also the whole thing with my daughter is you can't just say, come down for lunch. You've got to fit in with her lifestyle, which generally involves online gaming, which means a certain chunk of time. So I thought I now can't just say I give her a 10-minute warning. I've got to think of how long a Fortnite match is or something to give her that time.
Mm.
But time is something that I am organised and completely disorganised at the same time. I put loads of effort in, which makes me look organised. But I am somebody who thinks I've got loads of time.
Mm.
But yeah, it's just interesting. One of the questions, Peter, is with PIN numbers, does muscle memory help? That's what I just want to ask that question.
That's true, actually. Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, some people have done that, and I think it does for me sometimes as well. If I think about a certain sequence, I can put it in. The big one for me, as I said, is just like dates. I'm quite good at remembering sort of historical dates. No idea why, but anyway, I will just kind of associate it with like, oh, this happened in that year, like 1945 or something. So like that, then I will suddenly remember. So I use it that way. Another thing to say is that Monzo, for example, get top marks from dyscalculics because they do allow you to use passcodes on the app. So if you're using that for banking, that's actually really good for someone with dyscalculia. But anyway, so muscle memory, associating things with date, friends' birthdays, family's birthdays, all of this kind of stuff is somehow often how a lot of us end up remembering things, because we're not going to remember a random sequence of numbers.
Interesting. I used to remembering registration plates are always a nightmare.
Yeah.
So I always turn them into a sentence.
Yeah, that's quite good. Yeah. Exactly. That would work for me. Yeah.
But my wife's current car, I won't say what it is, but basically in my head, what I'm saying is a headline of a newspaper article. It's somebody aged something has done something.
I should that.
So I find a name with the initials, aged that. Then I've got to do, they've done something with the last 3 letters.
I should also add 1945 is not my PIN number, so don't try. I was thinking that just there. I was like, I'm not meant to what my PIN number is, but yeah. I mean, all of these things. I mean, it's budgeting. It's enormous. I mean, one of the other big tips that I've got, if anyone's listening that has dyscalculia, I mean, they might well know this, but one thing that I find is really good about a Monzo, actually, again, is that it allows you to save money into different pots, which is so helpful if you have, I mean, for lots of people, of course, but specifically for people with dyscalculia, because it is so hard to know, okay, I need to save this money every month for my gas bill or whatever. And it really takes a lot of the stress out there. And I think, I'm hopefully as well, we do in my lifetime get to a point where banks think more about people with dyscalculia and low numeracy. Some have started to think that way, but I think it's very, very important.
I also bank with Monzo, and there are bits in the app I don't use because I spend all my money on a credit card, so it comes in. I don't get all the benefits, but they have lots of things how you can categorize your spending. Yeah. And then you can do trends, and it will look over your spending over each month, and it does it in a really simple, clear way. And I'm like, if you're rubbish at maths or you have a maths, it's like, this is just really going to help you. And the different pots thing,
Yeah.
if you've got to spend something once a year, you can literally have a pot.
Yeah.
And there's loads of nice, cool things in Monzo that I really like. Problem is the way I spend money with a credit card and then just pay it off a month. It doesn't really, Monzo, I don't really use those features, but Monzo, coming from another bank, HSBC, which seems to be in the dark ages, it has been a complete revelation of a very digital, forward-thinking bank with lots going on.
Yeah.
Other
So
banks
if Monzo
are available.
If Monzo are listening, this is not sponsored by Monzo, but we'd always be open to that, Monzo. So,
Exactly.
Yes, other banks are available, but I prefer Monzo.
Exactly. I also
actually Starling is very good in a similar way for pots of money. To be fair,
it is. Yeah. So that thing.
I think there's a breed of new banks coming out which are all doing new things. Go on, Peter.
No, I was just going to say it's like a thing where you can't say that you endorse one party or something, so you have to like say all these other things. But yeah, Monzo and Starling.
I don't think we literally have that problem on podcasts. I think it's when you start to get broadcasting on TV level, then you have to say all that stuff. But yeah, you can be as preferential as you want on podcasts because it is just our own opinions.
Yeah. No. Exactly.
But obviously the Zencast does not endorse any bank. All that rubbish. We just need that person to come in and do the small print at the end of the financial adverts to say we do not endorse anyone, other banks are available and all that sort of rubbish. So yeah, so time blind is obviously a big thing. And when you are talking about budgeting, there is your kind of monthly budgeting, which things like Monzo, and there are quite a few things which can help you, but then you've got to be able to learn how to set them up and understand create the rules to create a rule, you have to understand them. But I'm guessing you also like going into a shop and you go around Tesco's and you're going, right, I've got 100 quid. Do you find that kind of going, where am I on this? Do you struggle with that?
Absolutely.
Does scan as you go help with that?
Yeah, I mean, they do actually, but absolutely. So one thing I have to do, so I can't just go in shopping blind. So I can't just go in and just put things in the basket or whatever and think. I mean, sometimes I have done that and then been like, wait a minute, I have to think about money. So what I end up doing actually, which is quite laborious, but I do just sort of write on like the notes app. I will write how much something was, and then at the end, I will then just like copy and paste that into a calculator, and then put something back. For example, I'm supposed to do that. Actually, I should say, like, I'm not really always that organized to do that, but in the best world, that would be my everyday practice. But I think that is important because as we say, dyscalculics frequently. I mean, this is the area that we have found that dyscalculic adults struggle the most in. So, the everyday shop, that's very, very hard for dyscalculics, and making sure that they're not going over budget. And particularly as well, because shops will often have the sort of, buy one, get one half price, or the kind of, 40% off loo roll or whatever. And like that is very, very difficult because I can't work out what 40% is. To be honest, I don't even know what the sum is to get to that 40%. So, I mean, I had to have to say hands up. I have been told before, I've had maths classes where people have told me that till they're blue in the face, but I can't retain that information and I can't just do that. I will have to stop and Google, and, ain't nobody got time for that. So it's like, that's a big issue for dyscalculics,
It comes back to estimating.
Mm-hmm.
So it comes back to not being able to estimate. So if I'm going around the shop, I have the ability to say, oh, it's £4.50, that I'll count that as £5 and carry on adding just to be on the safe side. And I'll just round numbers to the nearest whole, or I'll look at the buy one, get one free and roughly relate it to the cheapest item. Well, dyscalculics can't do that. And also decimals are particularly difficult for dyscalculics. So that adds to that difficulty because is £4.99 is £4 something, not nearly £5. So
you've got something which is buy one, get one free is £5. Great. But that's 400 grams. But this one here is £3.29, but it's 287 grams. And I can do the math one at a time. And I could probably sat there and on a good day just go, that one's better value. But as soon as everything else in life is going on, I also struggle with that. But I do like, and lots of supermarkets, they do have the per 100 mil or per 100 grams pricing on, which generally makes life a lot easier. But again, you still got to be able to adjust to that and understand that. And I suppose one of the benefits of doing your online shopping,
Yes.
so we do click and collect, is you can you get a whole week to get that money right. You can sit there and add and remove and change things. So we sit there and went, that's a big number. Why is it so big? You go through there and go, but it is, that's what I like about that is you sit there and you know, whereas I often find surprised that, especially when you walk around a supermarket and you put all the things you shouldn't in, you have an idea of how much it's going to cost. And you go, my gosh, why is it all that much? And then you realise you've thrown in 2 bottles of wine.
And that's what a dyscalculic won't have, though.
No,
an idea of how much it should cost. So, and that's really difficult to explain. So they're not going to have an idea going to the supermarket of how much what they need should be, roughly. And that puts another whole edge on it. So if they spend, Emily, for example, bless her, another one of our adults, she's always really over generous with presents relative to what she earns. And everyone always tells her that's too much for you to spend. But for her, it's just, well, the person said they wanted it, so that's what you buy them. So that concept of how much things cost, the value of that compared to what you earn, for example, is very difficult to grasp. And that's something that's difficult for you or I to understand.
Yeah.
Because we just know going to the supermarket that we should spend, say, £80 is roughly what we spend each week. But I doubt Peter knows roughly what he spends each week. Do you, Peter?
It's
put you on the spot.
I mean, to be honest, actually, I really sympathise with Emily. Hi, Emily. What Emily says as well, because I'll also say I've been in the same situation as well, and you won't realise until afterwards. You're like, well, I probably shouldn't have spent that much on. When you look at your bank account, you're like, why is this that? And you realise, well, I've spent money on this. So I think this is, it's a real problem. People with dyscalculia, and I don't know. Yeah, we need to have more support for that. I think because, as you say, it's not it's not an intelligence thing, is it? So
no, but it's interesting. It's kind of the manipulating the numbers makes you struggle with, but it's that interesting that adding the value. That's the bit which I find really interesting. The value of how much time, or the value of almost like, so that's £1,000 is that much. If I spend that much, I've got this much left. So the whole thing of working out what mortgage you can afford or anything, there is a value, and you kind of, and I think for most of us, we don't know we're doing it. It's a subconscious thing. It's just happening. You know that 20p when you were 7 was a lot of money. 20p now, you might not even pick it up. if you walk past one, you're going, that's 20p. It's not really worth much these days because of inflation. But that whole understanding of how much money is based on all those experiences. And I remember your parents used to pay like £200 a month, £200 a year insurance. And you go, we'll get there. And you don't. And you've got all these references in your head that you can quantify and qualify things. And you can't. Not through an intelligence thing, not through any decision or choice you've made. You just have an inability, but it's not stopping you in anywhere else. It's just a very isolated difficulty.
And it's why whenever I'm teaching young children, I say to parents that we've moved much away from cash, but actually cash helps you understand value. And paying on a card does take away some of the value. It's nice for people like Peter because he doesn't have to worry how much, whether he's getting cheated or, the machine tells you tap the card, walk away. It's reassuring that you don't have to deal with money. But if we can understand money better and how much value it is from a young age. So I always say to my clients with their children, I want you to set them up with money pots, not banking apps, money pots with actual pocket money, and start them early with a bills account, a savings account, a spending account, a giving account, if that's your inclination, and actually teach them that you put this much in your savings, this much in your spending, because it's a life skill you're building up from a really young age that many children, not just children with dyscalculia, don't currently have. They just see their parents tapping away at the card, and money has no real meaning. And we need to keep that meaning, especially in people who aren't going to develop that in other ways. They need to actually physically hold the cash and work with it and see what that buys.
I think at home, people need to be more open with talking about money, because I think when I was young, money was never mentioned. But the thing is, you kind of get an idea. You're kind of going, well, that's probably got lots of money. That probably costs a lot. And I can see we just spent that much on a thing. And you ask your parents and they go, oh, we don't have the money. You're going, well, you had the money for this and you're going to spend this much on this. And you just bought a new car. So you obviously do have the money. But it's understanding that all that stuff was budgeted for and it's coming out of a kind of a different pot. And I think, we're much more open with my children that, okay, yes, I do have £30 for that. However, would you like to do this? Would you like to be able to? And it's that balance of, we have to pay these bills. See, I think more open conversations with money help everyone. And especially, I'm guessing, for dyscalculic, where you are. Do you say someone is dyscalculic, or do they have dyscalculia? That's one of my questions I also had.
Think of it. I tend to say has dyscalculia because I think it sounds better. Dyscalculic sounds a bit odd, and I think you probably invite more questions if you say dyscalculic. So I tend to say has dyscalculia, but I don't think there's a set rule on it. But yeah, I mean, I should. Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
Well, I was just going to.
I was meandering off.
No,
anyway.
I was just going to say though, just to get this in, is that if you genuinely are having issues though with any of this stuff, the Dyscalculia Network is genuinely there for you. And I think my discovery of Dyscalculia Network was when I was struggling with these maths GCSEs, and I didn't know where to turn. And I know that the BDA, so British Dyslexia Association, does work on dyscalculia, but to be honest, for me, it would never have occurred to me to go there because I don't have dyslexia, and it's quite the reverse, and so it didn't really feel like my territory. So when I saw there was this organisation on Facebook that was the UK, and it was working with dyscalculia, and Cat wrote to me actually because I put a message on a board. Honestly, it was like all my prayers have been answered, and instantly Cat understood where I was coming from. And to be honest, it has been completely transformative on my own self-esteem and sense of self-worth, being involved in the Dyscalculia Network and the work that Cat and Rob are doing. So I think it's really important to support the Dyscalculia Network as a voice for people with dyscalculia that are actually out there saying, yes, there's this thing called dyscalculia. And I think that is important. We were talking about dyslexia and dyscalculia earlier. I think it is important to have a space which is like, this is about dyscalculia and it is related to other forms of neurodivergence. But, there is this specific place because maths affects, as we've said in this conversation, so much. I think it is really imperative that we start to give dyscalculia some of the attention that has been towards other forms of neurodivergence, because it's going to really, this affects people's, livelihoods in terms of money, putting people into debt, this kind of stuff, driving. I mentioned earlier driving. I wonder how many driving accidents actually are caused by people with numeracy issues, actually, because when you're in a stressful situation, my dyscalculia, I find, gets worse when I'm sort of tired or whatever, I misread numbers more, stuff like that. Is that affecting people with, speedometers and things when they're driving? So it affects so much. So I think it is really important to just say that if you do have issues, Cat and Rob are there. And I said, I'm chair of the Adults Advisory Board. So this is a group of adults with dyscalculia who are advising Cat and Rob on anything to do with adults or sharing our experience from being kids with dyscalculia.
Anything to add to that, Cat?
No, I think that the reason that we set up the organisation in the first place was very much centred around the fact that there wasn't anywhere for people, which is quite shocking when you think about the number of years the BDA have been around, or the different autism or ADHD charities. So it is really important to us that we make a difference. We're a community interest company. We're not for profit. We're run nearly all entirely voluntarily. And the point of what we're doing is that there needs to be a voice for dyscalculic adults, dyscalculic children, and the people who support them, the educators and the parents who are supporting them, and people and employers later on. There needs to be somewhere that's central to all of those. So that's what we're trying to provide, is a central hub of information for people with dyscalculia. And I think particularly parents, it's very lonely to have a child with dyscalculia because there isn't as much known about it, and schools maybe don't know. So we do a lot of training, not just for schools, but for colleges, for teacher training establishments, which is great. We're starting to do that, but also for community organisations. Like we're working with Shannon Trust, who work in prisons. I've been working with Thames Valley Police recently. So it's really about making a community around dyscalculia, like there is around dyslexia, and like there is around autism, where people are willing, have somewhere to go, somewhere to look to for information. But also, we're just the hub. I think we're way past people who don't have I don't like the word condition, but a condition, a neurodivergent condition, talking for people. I'm not here to talk. I'm here to facilitate sharing a message that Peter and the other dyscalculic adults and children have. And my experience and Rob's experience in our day-to-day lives, in our working with children and adults with this, gives us insight, but we're never going to be dyscalculic. So the centre of the Dyscalculia Network is the community aspect and the fact that we have an advisory board of experts in dyscalculia, but the real experts are our adult advisory board, and they are the ones who are leading where we're going all the time and helping us to support people in the right way.
Excellent. I'm going to wrap it up. We have talked for about an hour, which is one again. I always aim for 45 minutes. We're about 20 minutes. We're about 20 minutes, an hour. I don't know. It happens every time. But you've given me a load of links. So there is a link to the Dyscalculia Network. There's a Facebook. There's your Twitter. I didn't do all your social medias, but you've also shared a couple of email. I've got both your email addresses. I've also got a link to Succeed with Dyscalculia. And also there's 2 links to BBC News articles where Peter was interviewed about various things. So that is all in the show notes, along with all the usual ways of getting hold of me and B Squared. And you'll find the show notes, as always, wherever you listen to the podcast, but also on the Zencast website. Please follow us on social media. On Twitter, we're at the Zencast. On Facebook, the Zencast. And on Instagram, the Zencast. And we're also just looking at TikTok, which is a whole other thing I'm learning about. And I'm too old for it. If you listen to us through Apple iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or any other place where you can leave a review, please leave a review and let others know what you think. And I might even start reading them out. And before we go, I'd just like to remind you to check out the Zencast sessions with over 100 great video CPD sessions. And if you haven't accessed a Zencast session, these are video CPD sessions, often with the same great guests as we have on the podcasts. We run 9 live sessions each year with 2 free send briefings. The sessions are £10 each per school, and they are yours forever. So you can watch live on the day, or you can watch later on. It is completely up to you, and you get to rewatch, which is really, really good. And it's a great way to get CPD to all your current staff and future staff. So thank you for listening. We'll be back with another episode of the Zencast soon. It is goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.